The RMS Titanic was a passenger ship that sank in the Atlantic Ocean on April 15th, 1912. The Titanic was built by the White Star Line. The White Star Line was a luxury passenger ship company. The Titanic has two sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic. The Titanic was on her maiden voyage when an iceberg hit her starboard side. The bottom split in two, and her stern was lifted high into the air, until both parts sank. The wreck is still on the sea floor. This is an animation of how the Titanic sunk by the National Geographic Society. The Titanic hit an iceberg on her starboard side. She went around the way to keep her propellers from hitting. The first few chambers filled up where the iceberg hit. The bow started lifting over to her side, port side. Water started coming over the bow. More chambers fill up with water. The first smokestack falls. The stern is lifted high into the air. The lights go out. She brakes. The double hull lets go. The bow plunges towards the bottom. It sinks. The stern doesn't look as good as the bow. With the air, the shelling comes off, and it does a lazy circle all the way down. The bow hits the bottom. Same with the stern. That's the wreckage. The Titanic was a White Star Line ship that was divided into classes based on wealth. The wealthiest people went first into the lifeboats. They loaded the lifeboats by women and children first. The Titanic carried 224 passengers and crew, but only about 705 survivors left the ship. Even though the Titanic was a passenger ship, it carried mail. That's what RMS stands for, Royal Mail Ship. The ship also brought lots of cargo with it. The RMS Titanic was a major turning point in history, impacting many things. The International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea was organized after the Titanic sunk. They established it to help keep vessels and passengers safe over the water. It has been running since the Titanic sunk. They meet to form new safety rules overseas, also known as maritime law. One thing the Titanic impacted was telegraphing. The Radio Act of 1912 was put into action, along with the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea. When the Titanic sunk, the person at radio, Jack Phillips, sent out a distress signal. Almost none of the ships heard the distress signal. At the time, it was not required to have your radio on 24/7. Most ships would either listen for a few minutes every couple of hours, or they simply weren't listening to the radio. The Carpathian was the ship that rescued the Titanic survivors, and was one of the only ships that heard the distress calls. Some ships were closer to the Titanic than the Carpathian, but were not listening to distress calls. The Radio Act of 1912 was set up. With it, established special radio frequencies for certain situations. And those special stations were monitored 24/7. They established special radio stations because when the Carpathian returned to New York with the Titanic survivors, they radioed the names of all the Titanic survivors. At the time, anybody with a radio set could listen and say anything they please. Some radio pranksters said certain people were dead when they were alive, and also some even said that the Titanic hadn't sunk, which was a complete lie. Another thing, in 1912, President William Howard Taft made an executive order for all ships that dock in U.S. ports to have a wireless communication so they can assign tugboats to larger ships and safely bring them into port. Before the sinking, you didn't need a license to telegraph. Now you need a telegraphing license legally to use a telegraph or a handheld radio. My grandpa was impacted by this because he needed a license to do his job. Also, the ships carry a secondary power source. Also, in the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, they enforced a maritime law saying that all ships must have wireless communication radios that are to be monitored day and night. Shipping routes more southern. Also, when the Titanic was sinking, they fired rockets. These rockets were seen by the freighter SS Californian. The SS Californian witnessed the sinking, but at the time, Pattern rockets were a way to help other ships identify what ships you were on. After that, firing rockets is now known as a distress signal. Also, another major thing the Titanic impacted was lifeboats. Almost anyone could have guessed that. Of course the Titanic had lifeboats, but only 16 on the whole ship, each able to hold 65 people. In regards to lifeboats, to the disaster, they had been going by the Merchant Shipping Act of 1894, which stated that the number of lifeboats of a passenger ship should be based on weight of the ship. This law was completely demolished and a new one was made that the number of lifeboats on board must be based on the amount of people on board, not the weight. When they were building the Titanic, one of the general managers suggested that they use larger davits, cranes to lift more boats. But the White Star Line disagreed. The Costa Concordia is the same size as the Titanic. The Costa Concordia was the ship that ran aground off the coast of Italy. The Costa Concordia had 25 lifeboats with a higher passenger rate. Only 4 people died, where on the Titanic, 1,019 people died. Also, if you go on a cruise, it is required to do a practice drill, as if the ship were sinking. The Titanic's hull was designed to be unsinkable. It had watertight chambers to be sealed to stop the flow of water. Titanic's sinking also influenced changing of shipbuilding designs. The Titanic's hull was designed with a double hull. Double hull is 2 layers of hull, so that if the outside layer breaks, the second layer will not let water sink the ship. But the problem with the Titanic is not only did the iceberg hit the bottom of the ship, it also hit the side, where there was no double hull. Now, the hulls are built with double hull running up the part of the ship that is underwater, and above. After Titanic submerged, the U.S. Navy realized how dangerous icebergs could be. The U.S. Navy started an iceberg watch. The U.S. Navy also started commissioning ships to become icebreakers, like the USS Evergreen. But now they use planes and aircraft more frequently because it gets more work done in a shorter period of time. The icebreaker ships are U.S. ships, but on November 12, 1913, a treaty was signed with London to help fund the International Ice Patrol. The International Ice Patrol scans the North Atlantic and sends out iceberg warnings to ships. The Titanic was one of the most notorious tragedies of all time. The medieval time plague news spread a lot slower than the news about the Titanic. The reason being that the Titanic was the pride of Great Britain. In 1912 and before that, the Britannic, the Olympic, and the Titanic were the biggest ships of all time. It was also industrial pride of Great Britain. The Titanic is no doubt one of the biggest turning points in history, impacting major industries. The lifeboat industry was impacted probably the most, making changes to size and passenger rate. Also, lots of shipbuilding requirements came into action, along with the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea. Who could also forget about the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea? Another impact was the development for the International Ice Patrol and the Radio Act of 1912, which required you to have a telegraphing license to use a telegraph or handheld radio. Whatever happened to the Titanic's 2 sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic? The Britannic was torpedoed in World War I, and the Olympic was the only successful of the 3 White Star Line ships.